Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Beth Larson, and I'm the Executive Director at Resilience Advocates for Ending Violence. Resilience is the sole provider of domestic and sexual violence services in Ottawa and Allegan counties throughout West Michigan. In October, Netflix released a series called Maid. It's based on a 2019 memoir called Maid, Hard Work, Low Pay, and a Mother's Will to Survive. It's by Stephanie Land. Within 2 weeks of the show being released, it was streaming in the #2 spot on Netflix. In the series, a young mother named Alex faces numerous barriers as she attempts to leave her abusive boyfriend. If you've watched the series and aren't familiar with the dynamics of domestic violence, you might be wondering just how accurate the show's portrayal of leaving an abusive relationship is. Many of the survivors that we serve have experienced really similar barriers as Alex does throughout the series. While some of the services that Alex receives in the show are similar to those at Resilience, we thought it would be helpful to discuss the similarities and differences in philosophies related to assisting survivors in their journey to a life free from violence. Today, we're joined by Resilience staff Elizabeth, Leslie, Becky, and Megan. Their areas of expertise are emergency shelter, trauma therapy, prevention, and program administration. Megan is going to be our moderator today. So now I'll turn it over to Megan to start our panel discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Beth. A couple of housekeeping things. If you're familiar with Zoom, the way that this format is maybe a little different than you're used to. This is set up in a webinar format, so the only folks who are able to show their face and voice are Resilient staff. If you have any questions as we have this conversation, we encourage you to put them in the chat box. That's a great way to ask questions, and hopefully we'll have time at the end. Although we have an hour and a lot of really great things to talk about, I'm excited to have this conversation. If you'd like to send in a message, if you have any safety concerns, feel free to change the name on your Zoom box. You can click the 3 dots up at the top, click rename, and you're welcome to submit questions anonymously. And I also want to take a second to discuss that we are going to be discussing Maid, and it's a story about a lot of things, but about a young woman who is leaving an abusive partner. So we will be discussing aspects of domestic violence. So as always, if that's triggering, or even if it's not, please, we encourage you to take care of yourself during this conversation and afterwards too. If you would like to speak to an advocate at any time, our 24-hour helpline and email address have just been added to the chat box. So our 24-hour helpline is 800-848-5991, and we're more than happy to chat with folks for like concrete safety solutions, but also just to talk when people need to. That's what that helpline is there for. So now that that's out of the way, discussing Maid. It's a 10-part series on Netflix that I thought was done really well based off this memoir. And what I know a lot of other staff had were frequently asked questions that we got from our family and friends. I want to start with the way that the show portrayed shelter services, because that was kind of the immediate questions that I got from my friends and family were, are our cell phone policies the same? What are the rules like at shelter? What does it look? Is that what your program is like? So I want to ask Elizabeth. Elizabeth Burnett is our shelter program manager. Would you mind talking a little bit about what our emergency shelter named Ginny's Place is like in comparison to the show?
Sure. Yes. So if we start with, I know that one of the main questions was the cell phone usage. When she gets there, one of the first things she has to do is put her cell phone in a basket, and that's for confidentiality. And just abusers often will try to locate you, and you can easily do that through a cell phone. So again, all shelters vary in their policy about this, but we always work to empower our clients, and we strive to educate them as well, because usually they're at our shelter for a short amount of time. The average is about 45 days. So we want to make sure as they leave, they have a good safety plan in place. And a lot of times that includes, or it does include, technology as well. So we do allow clients to have their cell phones at shelter. And again, we educate them. So showing them how to turn off their location on their phone. There's also apps that abusers can put on a phone. And we can just provide information on those apps, or physically, you know, hey, do you want me to show you on your cell phone? Let's look through here. Let's see if there's any apps that look questionable, and then help them to get rid of those apps. We also educate on the dangers of social media. So for example, if you post something on Facebook, Facebook immediately can grab your GPS and it will show from your post your whereabouts. So turning off those locations on Facebook as well. And I'm not very familiar with like Twitter and all that. So, but we have advocates at shelter who are very versed in technology and the safety around technology. So, and another thing I just thought would be important to add about that is abusers often will have access to your email as well. So I do know in Maid that towards the end, the second time Alex comes, she does get a new email address, and Denise, the shelter advocate, helps her to sort of monitor that and checks in with her to see if there's been any activity that she thinks might be her abuser. So we do talk about that as well. And so even something as simple as a doctor's reminder, like the doctor's office sends a reminder to your email, things like that, we want to make sure that our clients are looking out for, because if the abuser has access to the email, they can easily see something like that and show up at the doctor's appointment. And it may be to harm them, but it may also be to try to get them to come back. So just anything like that, we really try to educate and empower. So clients know their abuser best. And that's again why we try not to take away their cell phone. They know how far their abuser will go in stalking them. So with us providing that extra information, they're able to make a more informed decision about how they will handle the communication themselves. And we don't want to take that away from them. Again, every shelter is different and they have reasons for their different policies, but we try not to add barriers. So I know in Maid, she had to, especially when she was trying to get into school, she went out and she set up her own little station right on the corner. So her child was taken care of and that was fine, but sitting out on the corner, that did provide another barrier really for her and just a safety concern. So yeah, I just wanted to point that out as well.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, that sometimes when we're trying to help people stay safe, we want to think through those unintended consequences, right? And I'm sure that Denise and her staff didn't intend for folks to have to sit down at the corner at the stop sign, but that's one of the things that you have to think through. What are the other rules like at shelter, if there are any? Like what can you talk a little bit about a little bit more about like the empowerment philosophy and how that comes into play with the rest of shelter?
Yes, so we try to be very non-rules based. Again, we want to provide our clients with information and referrals, resources, and then really empower them to make the decisions as to how they want to go from there. So I know a lot of questions that come up are about chores. You know, do you have chores at shelter, and is that going to interfere with maybe something I have to do, a phone call I have to make, somewhere I have to go? And we don't. We actually have an incentive-based program. So if you are able to do extra chores around the house, then we provide gas cards. So something, again, that will help. And then I'm trying to think what else. Curfews. We don't have a curfew, but we, again, assess safety. And if you're going to go somewhere, we just ask that you call us and make sure to check in and tell us that you're safe. Say if you're past, I think we ask like if you're going to be past midnight. That way, again, you're okay to make your own decisions. We understand that things come up, but we want to ensure your safety. So just that check-in phone call helps. Everyone has their own room at shelter. That comes up a lot. Am I going to have to share a room? So everyone, we really try to keep everyone in their own room, and then there's the shared spaces at shelter. We ask that everyone pick up after themselves, just like you would, you know, if you were at your own home. So yeah, I think those are some of the main things that come up that people are concerned about. You are free to come and go as you need to. Again, we just really stress that safety piece and just checking in and letting us know that you are safe.
Yeah, we want to make sure everybody at the shelter is safe. Awesome. Yeah. Another thing I wanted to kind of touch on with, you know, our discussion of the show was the way that it portrayed different dynamics of domestic violence and what harm doers do to maintain power and control over their person. And I'm really curious from the three of you, what did you see in the show, or what were some of those things that made you go like, oh, I've seen this with the clients I've been honored enough to work with, or this is a really common thing. I'm glad they have this in the show. Did you have moments like that?
Yeah, I think it's a very good portrayal of things that just come up that are unforeseen. So yeah, when he sort of pushes her up against the wall and hits something close to her, that is definitely a red flag. That was one thing that came up, and just also trying to that honeymoon phase, like she leaves and then he really tries to sober up. Not that that is the main thing that he he needs, because it's about the power and control, not the getting sober. But he asks her questions, and okay, if that's how you want it to be, then we can do it that way. But that's obviously just that honeymoon period, because you see as the series goes on that changes again. So that you can see that cycle of violence there.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Becky.
I was just going to say how he used her mother and her mental health challenges and her crisis as a way to get back in. That's a very nonchalant way of manipulating their way back in and saying, like, I don't want you to go through this alone. you know, you shouldn't have to go through this, and let me be there for you. And then insisting and just showing up and kind of pressuring her into it when she has no kind of other choices or support. And that can also be the time where they can see their, you know, the harm doer in a different light, like, oh, you know, they do care. And it's a tool of manipulation that's really hard to see when you're in the situation.
Well said. Yeah. I had a friend tell me that, you know, as much as she had tried to understand why people go back to abusive partners, that the show really helped her understand why someone would decide to go back. You know, about halfway through the show, he's been helping with her mother's mental health crisis. He seems to be a good dad. He seems to be trying to stay sober. He's, you know, making all of these promises about the fact and pointing out that, you know, they belong together and whatnot. She feels comfortable with him. And to the point where the audience themselves almost thinks, wouldn't it be better to move back in with him rather than to be homeless? So you can see how that thought process was happening with Alex, and how that's not an uncommon thing to happen in abusive relationships, right? Like, we are made, the best part about being human is that we love each other and that we connect with each other and we form these attachments. And by design, those attachments are really difficult to end. Like, you want to continue to forgive people, to have them in your life, especially when they're your family, right? Like, she shares a daughter with this man. And the way that they portrayed, you know, her going back, and then I can't remember what it is that he did pretty soon after that. Oh, took the car away from her. That was a pretty quick sign for Alex of, oh no, this is going to, you know, continue to be an issue, that he's going to have power and control over my life. But I loved that she had the words to explain it this time. You know, she'd gotten validation from the shelter and her friends at the shelter that emotional abuse is abuse. That is intimate terrorism. If you're afraid, even if your partner doesn't hit you, if you're afraid of your partner hitting you, that can cause post-traumatic stress, that can cause unhealthy things. And it's not anything that anybody deserves or should be treated like that. So, yeah.
Megan, I liked when the social worker asked her, what does fake abuse look like? And it just challenged her a little bit in that moment to, like, you know, we want to disbelieve that, oh, I'm not a victim. He's not my partner's not hitting me. It's not physical, but there's intimidation and coercion and control and manipulation, and it is abusive. And so I think that was a powerful moment for Alex to kind of like have that switch of thinking about it. Like, yeah, I am being abused.
I think my favorite scenes were the scenes where she chats with Danielle, the character who's been in the shelter maybe 4 or 5 times before. And she shuts down after the court conversation where Sean gets temporary custody of, I think the little girl's name is Maddie, and just lays down on the carpet. And I love the scene where Danielle says, you don't think I've been on this carpet? You don't think that other people have been where you are right now? You got to get angry. You got to get yourself a DV advocate. I love, she says, get your ducks lined up. But the way that she really explained the escalation of abuse, I thought was such a great scene, especially when she was talking about, like, did you think when I was on my first date with, you know, my boyfriend, that he would say, oh, pass the salt, someday I'm going to strangle you? And I thought, ooh, great. You know, these people don't choose abusive relationships. It's something that that comes on in a way that, like, it tends to be when moments in your relationship are that your partner knows that it would be more difficult for you to leave. So yeah, grows like mold. We have I loved that line in the show. But we see that a lot too, that a lot of times, you know, abusive behaviors might start after a really big, like, event. that kind of ties the two people together in a way that the harm doer knows this person can't leave me very easily if I do this. So thinking back on the show, you know, when Alex, I think, is talking to Denise about like, when did you start seeing these behavioral changes? And Sean, she talks about like, well, when I got pregnant and he was mad at me that I wasn't getting an abortion, he, you know, screamed and berated and said I was ruining his life by being pregnant. That was kind of the first moment that, and I don't think that's uncommon for moments like that to happen after a pregnancy, after a marriage. Not that they have to be tied to those events, right? Like it's not a rule, but that, you know, that's not an uncommon thing that we see.
Yeah, I would just like to add that we do see many times when somebody is pregnant, because the focus does become on the baby, things do tend to escalate at that time. I just thought that would be important to say, as well as, and I think we touched on it a little bit, but I always just want to reiterate that like alcoholism or mental health does not cause abuse. It's always a choice. There's plenty of people that drink or have alcohol problems, even dependency and mental health, that do not choose to abuse. Just had to get that out there.
I appreciate that you guys have both made this point of like the alcoholism does not cause domestic violence, right? Even though Sean was dealing with alcoholism, that it's not one of the causes. Like if you think, you know, about the any other time that you've used substances, if you're somebody who doesn't harm someone, just because I had a couple of drinks doesn't mean that I'm going to hit someone. That's not how my nights usually go. But it is a typical excuse that some folks will use to explain their behaviors and to apologize and to get into that honeymoon stage that Elizabeth was talking about. So domestic violence isn't caused by mental health issues. It's not caused by alcoholism or substance use, or even it's not caused by anger issues either. Sean has moments where he can be incredibly charming to the other people in their social system, right? So he wants to have power and control over Alex, but he's able to maintain these friendships. He's able to maintain a relationship with her father, which is problematic, you know, but he isn't someone who necessarily, if it was an anger issue, you would see that anger issue in all of the rest of his relationships, but you're only seeing it in his relationship with his wife. And I think a little bit with his child in the last episode, which is the thing that freaks him out and decides, you know, when that moment that he decides to give up custody. But yeah, that's important to discuss.
Which is rare from my experience of working in the field for over 20 years, that typically the harm doer does not give up custody. And so that was actually a really surprise for me watching the film. I was like, wow, yay. But they usually do not take any sort of accountability at all.
Yeah, she got really lucky, right? Like the high-powered lawyer that was in her corner, you know, having her ex kind of step away from wanting to parent. Becky, what lengths have you seen people go to continue to use the children in a way to continue to have power and control over their partner?
I've seen it go on for years, even after the children are grown. There's always still going to be some sort of connection in some sense. Well, there can be, depending on the situation, I guess, but I've seen it happen after they're grown. But when they're young too, it's just a way to co-parenting with a person who harms others and has power and control is very, very difficult, as you can imagine. Because if they don't have power and control, it's like a game almost. And because anytime they're lacking power and control, they're going to continue seeking it out. It just doesn't seem to end. I would say, you know, every situation is very unique. So don't get me wrong, but I see it play out typically, even after they're remarried, sometimes with another partner, they're still trying to gain power and control with the children and through the children. And so I really don't see it ending typically, in most cases, is what I'd say.
Yeah, it kind of continues until the children are adults, or don't, doesn't it? One of the other things I really liked about the portrayal of domestic violence services isn't Denise great? Like the character, she's the shelter worker. And the very first time that Alex comes to the shelter, she says, "You must be Alex and Maddie. You're safe now. You can breathe. We do a lot of breathing here. I think she calls her baby girl. But we do a lot of breathing here. That's good." Becky, can you talk a little bit about like, why does Denise encourage Alex to breathe?
Well, it's going to lead into what I'm going to talk about next in trauma in the brain, but literally oxygen getting to the brain can help us be present and be able to think. It regulates our emotions. I didn't know if I was going to have time to get to this, but there was a point where I don't know, the wealthier lady she cleans for, that's a lawyer, turns her down when it seems like such a simple ask. I can't remember what it was exactly, but she's looking in the mirror, and she had learned in group therapy to picture her place, which was kayaking, in the sun. And that's a form of emotional regulation when she was no longer regulated, because our emotion part of our brain is the same as our survival part of our brain. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a bear, a person of harm. It can just be a high emotion that puts us into a state of having like a trauma reaction. And so she was trying to calm herself down, looking in the mirror and seeing that. And so that was a visualization kind of technique, but I think she was breathing as well. And again, deep breathing brings us to the moment. It gets us in our body. It does so many things. It's very, very powerful. And not to mention like just the oxygen to the brain, so we can come back online. Because when we're in that survival emotional place, our thinking part of our brain, without getting too technical, where we take in new information, our most executive part of our brain goes away. And I'll talk about that more in a bit, but so that's
I'm skipping.
Short answer.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm skipping around a little bit. I did notice we have a comment about the amount of bureaucracy and hoops that Alex has to go through as a young mom, trying to find resources. I think she says at the end, like, I was on 7 types of assistance. I think I'll ask Elizabeth, do you mind talking a little bit about like, is that what does seeking government assistance and going through the bureaucratic hoops tend to look like for survivors who are seeking safety and stability in their own home?
So very, very similar to that. There's a lot of paperwork to fill out. And then that's actually another reason it's important to have your cell phone, because a lot of this stuff is online now as well. It's almost more difficult to get a paper application than it is to just fill the information out online. And a lot of times when someone leaves, they're not remembering to grab their laptop, even if they have one. So we at Shelter definitely will help them fill out that paperwork. They can do it on their cell phone. We have computers as well at Shelter, but it's a lot. And especially if you have young kids that aren't in school, you have to fill out a lot of paperwork, and the kids are running around and they need your attention. And of course we try to help with that, but it's just a lot. And there's paperwork for food stamps. There's paperwork, for daycare. And then the whole scene where she said, okay, so I need a job in order to qualify for daycare, but I need daycare in order to get a job. And that is so true. And it is such a difficult balance. Thank goodness we at Resilience do have some wiggle room to be able to help put a child into daycare, pay maybe that first week while mom gets a job and then is able to get on the assistance. But yeah, with all those, I love those money signs coming across the screen too. It's the truth. It's the plain truth that it's just difficult. But again, us being there, just trying to support how we can, is very helpful. And I just wanted to comment too, we do get that a lot when clients will come downstairs after a day or two, sometimes being in their room, and just like they're able to think because they were able to actually sleep and feel safe, and their children as well. So yes, rest and just being able to breathe and feel safe can often, temporarily at least, help with the crisis and being able to focus and go to the next step as filling out paperwork. So
Yeah, that paperwork can feel insurmountable. Thank you. You're reading my mind. Insurmountable, especially when Becky was talking about the way that trauma in the brain works. If you're in survival mode, especially for those first 2 weeks after something really terrifying has happened, if you're worried about, in that moment, if you were worried about your safety or the safety of your children, or the safety of anyone else, if anybody else has been through any kind of trauma, a car accident, a natural disaster, you might be a death in the family, you might be pretty familiar about the fact that it's really hard to concentrate on anything, get any details in those first 2 weeks afterwards. So that shows up in our crisis services as well. We have walk-ins available at our main office between 9 and 5. And I remember if it's safe, checking with the survivor, is it okay? Is it going to be safe for you to leave here with paperwork? But the things we discuss, writing them down, because it can be really easy to forget details. When you're in survival mode, your brain is just focused on keeping you alive. And it doesn't want you to spend that energy necessarily on checking off boxes and making sure that your T's are crossed on all this bureaucratic stuff. Another thing that I thought was interesting about the show was, I loved the running tally of the money, but also, the discussions that she has with her employers of, you're allowed to work this much. How her labor is kind of exploited, and Alex has to do some work of like, if I earn more than a certain threshold, I lose some of one of the 7 types of government benefits that we're on. So in nonprofit world, that's called ALICE, Asset Limited, Income Constrained, and Employed. And I thought they just did a really great job of showing how you can be a hard worker and be employed, and still that is not a guarantee, the way that we have things set up, that you can escape poverty, and find safety and stability for yourself and your children, which is messed up.
I've seen so many people fall in the cracks with that as well. And so, even like a $50 a month raise can mean going from $300 of food help a month to 11, just for an example. And don't quote me on that, the numbers exactly, but that's what I see. And I have so many clients that are trying to, they don't want assistance anymore. They want to be independent, but it's very hard. They move up and then they get something else knocked off. And so the system is tough, to say the least.
Becky, what else jumped out at you on the show as, our trauma expert on staff, about the way that they portrayed people's reactions to trauma?
So many things. And the trauma in the brain and all the things, I could probably literally give like a week presentation. So I'm going to try to wrap it up as quickly as I can in the short amount of time we have. So it trauma, I just want to start off by saying it impacts the brain. And some of the normal reactions and triggers that they shown through Alex. And I'm going to also talk a little bit about the impact on Maddie and children, some of what they showed and what they didn't show. So after, I think it's really important to talk about after the traumatic experience, like the trauma doesn't end. Okay. So there's triggers and trauma reminders. That's just one part of it. Right. But there's also all these other traumas and change. I don't know which ones exactly Alex felt as traumatic, but it seemed like the systems. I mean, moving 9 times, 9 separate moves, that's traumatic. The daycare situation, constantly worrying about money. There's a real thing about choosing food, housing, over safety. Like it's a constant battle. And I think they portrayed that really well. And then not to mention the re-victimization. So all these systems can feel like re-victimization, the constant questioning, the shame, even like her mom, the friends, the abuser. So much more trauma, I think, happens and people realize after. So when people say, why don't they just leave? It drives me nuts because there's just so many barriers to leaving, and I know what they will face as they leave. And so to kind of think about some of the traumatic responses, the easiest way to explain it without getting all into the neuroscience is thinking of Tigger and Eeyore. And so these are just 2 different responses, and it can look very different for every individual. And when I think of Tigger, it's that constant look she had, that constant sense of urgency. I paid attention to her eyes a lot. And so sometimes she wasn't there, and that was more of the shutdown Eeyore. And then there was sometimes she was on super high alert, waiting for the next dangerous thing to happen. And it doesn't necessarily have to be physically dangerous. It could be a barrier with the system, a barrier with this, wealthy cleaning lady who she asks a simple favor. It could be any of those things that feel like a huge danger to the brain because it brings up high emotion. So again, I think it's important to know that everyone experiences it differently, and they can go back and forth from Eeyore to Tigger, and there's all different variances in between that, and they're all very normal. One example, that when she's in the hospital after she finds out her mom's all cut up and she is not there, Sean's talking to her and she's kind of having tunnel vision. So this can happen during like a panic attack, but it also can just be disassociation, meaning she's going somewhere else in her brain to stay safe and survive the situation, because it's just layer upon layer of things, and her brain's like, no more, I can't handle anymore. And that's the same situation when you see her in that black tunnel. That's my interpretation, and kind of my analysis is that her brain's like, nope, I can't do it. Like, it's either too dangerous or just too much. And many times she faced trauma from a child. We learn these survival skills very young. And so she probably learned to dissociate, and maybe in the cupboard, go somewhere else in her brain to stay safe very young. And it's very easily to go there after traumatic events, or even just when there might be a little bit of feeling of uncomfortability, because it's what they know and it works. So that being said, let's see what else I was going to say. That our brain, regardless of who we are and what we've been through, always is constantly scanning for danger to keep us safe, right? And so that's a natural, normal thing. But when we've had trauma, it's kind of amped up. And so that's kind of, again, where the trauma response will come in, and the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response will come in, where we automatically react. And so like one of my biggest things I hope that people take away is that when we have a trauma reaction, whether we're a kid, adult, whoever, it happens in milliseconds typically, and our thinking brain is gone. We don't think, our brain chooses how we will best survive. So you see times where she's more of, I would call it fight, when she's more like standing up for herself, advocating for herself, but there's other times she shuts right down. And that's many times no choice of ours. It's our brain that chooses. The other important takeaway, I think, is whether it's a child or adult, is that every behavior that someone has after a traumatic incident is typically trying to articulate some need that we can't express with words. So like when we talk about children, a lot of times, like she had that tantrum, they didn't show a lot of behavioral or neurological challenges with Maddie, as I call them, but most of the community would see it as a behavioral challenge. She had a temper tantrum when her dad yelled. That's about the only thing I saw. But that was a way of her saying, I don't feel safe and I don't have the words to tell you. So get me out of here. I need my mom, right? And so I think that's another important takeaway, is whether it's an adult having a temper tantrum or shutting down, it's a way to communicate a need. I don't feel safe. I'm looking out for danger. I'm trying to stay safe. I need comfort. I need nurture. It just depends. And to go back to the kids a little bit, and we know, so the cycle can repeat, but it's important to know that all survivors or people of harm do not always repeat. So, but in this case, they both parents had been through trauma and witnessed domestic violence. And therefore it did the cycle did repeat. So my other thing is intervention the earliest as possible, because of the way the brain develops. In those first 3 years, we learn to walk, talk, so many things. Development is disrupted. Now, they didn't show that a ton with Maddie, but typically developmental disruption can look like academic. It could be emotional. They're just not emotionally where they are as far as age, or socially, and lots of other ways probably as well. But they didn't show that a ton, but that is typically what we see. And that can be, we help them get that brain back online and all the things through therapy to hopefully make it so they grow up to be healthy adults and have healthy relationships. I'm probably forgetting a million things here. Anything you guys can think of that I should touch on?
What makes the most amount of difference in the resilience of a child?
Safety. So we will see children wherever they're at. So whether the parent is still in the relationship, but I don't want to say best, but I guess the most progress and healing can happen when they're safe. So a lot of times there's 50-50 custody. And so they're still being put into an unsafe position when they go to the harm doer's home. And so it's hard to undo that. And then as we undo that and get them feeling safe again, they go back again. So that can be very tough. It's not impossible. And I've still seen lots of progress happen in those situations. But if they can be safe from any sort of further, it doesn't have to be physical. And that's really important to know. Like many times I'm safety planning for further mental injury and emotional. And that could be, the harm doer has a new partner and there's more domestic violence happening, or there's just lots of power and control still happening. They're overhearing the way they talk to the non-offending parent, or it could be, there's emotional abuse happening with them. I have to say, like, we work with children who aren't the primary victim, but at the same time, I haven't seen a kid who hasn't been the primary victim in some sense, in the fact of emotional and mental injury. So whether, that's intentional or not, the power and control doesn't stop with the parent. It's happening with the children as well. They might be a good parent in some aspects, but again, their main goal is to have power and control over people. And it doesn't, if it's happening with one parent, it's almost, I would say, from what I've seen in my experience, happening with the kids as well. And I've never not seen a child be afraid of that parent in some aspect. And that'll come out eventually, typically through the process of therapy.
That's a great way to explain it. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I want to chat too about the way that people in Alex and Sean's life responded to the violence that was going on. In the very first episode, a couple of instances come to my mind of how people react to the abuse. In the very first episode, Alex, it's the scene where she's watching and making sure that Sean is asleep, walks over the broken glass, gets in the car, drives away to her friend's house, hoping to find a place that she and Maddie can rest their heads safely for the evening. And when she arrives at the home, there's a couple, I think there's a couple that lives there. And the woman comes out, is like, oh my gosh, what happened? But the reaction that she gets from the man, he says, don't be a B word. He says he's sorry, go back home, what are you doing? And she makes a split-second decision of, okay, I can't stay here, I have to, and ends up spending the night in the park, after she realized, like, I don't have anywhere else safe to go tonight. That's obviously not what we want to see. And there's other instances too of her family and Sean's friends minimizing the abuse, not validating her experience. There was even an instance where I thought this was a really powerful example that her father is there for dinner, and there is a moment where Sean controls what Maddie is doing in that moment. She tries to leave I think, help me if I'm getting the scene wrong, but she tries to leave the dinner table to rest, to end the conversation that she's not happy with. And Sean makes her stay and says, you're being rude to our guests, and does it in such a threatening way that it's very clear that there will be consequences for Alex if she leaves the table. Later on, she asks her dad, like, you saw that, you witnessed that, and it would really help in the court if you were able to say that, you saw this instance of emotional abuse. It'll help my case with custody. And the dad says, I didn't see abuse. I saw two couples, or, a couple that were having a really difficult time, completely minimizes. And he also likes to say, this is not the time that you need to leave Sean. He needs you more than ever. Not bringing in the fact of what Alex needs or what Maddie needs. The support that she's getting is that family is getting is around Sean's needs, right? So I'm really curious to hear Leslie's thoughts on those instances. Leslie is our prevention and systems change manager, and discusses a lot of systems and bystander intervention things that we have. And what do you think, Leslie?
Absolutely. Thanks for pointing those scenes out too. And there's a few more that come to mind for me, but definitely that we have to believe the person. We have to be supportive, non-judgmental. It's not about, well, I don't know if he was really being abusive. Like, when someone says that they feel threatened or hurt, disbelief is the worst thing we could do. And so the simplest way for us to remember of how do I best support someone? How do I best support a survivor? Is listen, believe, and support. We want to listen, really listen, not ask 21 questions, but really not ask questions. Let them speak, let them tell their story, let them vent and share, not chime in with judgment or disbelief, or he didn't really mean it, which is what the father did, or the husband of the person where she went. She needs to be believed, and support looks like offering to go with her for services, providing a helpline, asking what she needs. What do you need? How could I be helpful to you? She did have a friend who gave her a car, and he was trying to be helpful. He was also crossing boundaries, and it felt a little creepy, actually. And so that wasn't as helpful as it could have been. Another place where I saw some bystander opportunity, I wish that when the father was meeting with Sean to have coffee and pie on a regular basis, apparently, I wish that that had been less about collusion, which it felt like, and more about holding Sean accountable. And I don't think the father was in the right position. He had a history of abuse. He wasn't the right person for that. But had Sean's friend gone to coffee with Sean on a regular basis, had conversations with him, I don't know if Sean would be open to that, but someone needed to hold Sean accountable. Someone in Sean's life, reflecting back to him, how is this benefiting you or hurting you the way that you're behaving in this relationship? I care about you, Sean, but here's what I'm seeing. And so really being honest about behavior that's harmful. That doesn't mean he's going to listen, but at least we're attempting to hold him accountable. I would like to share a handout on the screen. When we think about how can we best help, I think there's some ways to do that. So I want to share this document. Hopefully you can see it. But when we think about how we want to be present, we're being empowering, we're holding confidentiality. I'm not finding out what happened in order to gossip about it. I don't need all the details. I'm just there to help. And we think about calling someone in or calling somebody out. And we want to avoid shaming the perpetrator, the person, the harm doer. We want to not lean in. We don't want to yell at them or be aggressive, but rather model healthy behavior, hold them accountable, say factual information. Here's what I'm seeing you doing, and this is how it's harmful. And when we support a survivor, we want to listen, believe, and be supportive, and give a referral if possible to like a helpline or a service or somewhere that they could go. When we think about what to do in a situation, there's a few tactics, and I gave you some websites here that you can look this up a little bit more in detail, but Hollaback is out of New York, I believe, and or Boston, I can't remember, but they have the 5 Ds and they do street harassment and sexual harassment prevention. So we think about bystander intervention as I can be a distraction. Maybe I interrupt or ask a question, especially if I see a situation in public, like at a diner or a restaurant or somewhere or on the street that becomes a little escalated. I can spill something or just say, oh, do you know when the bus comes? Like just be an interruption to kind of help either create space so someone can leave that situation easily or interrupt what's happening. I can delegate. I can go to a store manager, a bartender, someone at work, my manager, supervisor, someone to get help, even like the police or security guard. Or with delegate, if I'm witnessing something really that's escalating, and if I'm with a group of people or in public with strangers, like at the mall or somewhere, you can say, hey, I need your help. Could you, help me like talk to her or talk to him, and you call 911 or something. So there's some delegation there around how to help best. And whenever we help, it's always about what's going to be most safe for the survivor. We might delay. It might feel a little intimidating to intervene at all. So, but after the fact, we might ask the survivor, do you need help? I noticed what happened. Is there anything I can do to help you? And be a help after something occurs. Or it might be more direct. We might have to intervene and just say, you need to stop doing what you're doing. You're being harmful, and name it, like what you're doing is abusive, aggressive, racist, homophobic, whatever it is, name what it is, and it's harmful, and this needs to end. So those are just some quick tips for what do we do. And then when we express empathy and compassion and care and that support, there's things that we can say, and I care, I see, I feel, I want, I will, how will we show up for them? And when we say I want, it's not really about us. It's what we hope for them but it's still focusing on the survivor and what the survivor needs. Even if I say, I want you to get some help and they decide not to go to shelter, it's okay if they don't take my advice. It's okay that they get to choose for themselves what happens next and what's best for them. So, but we can say, you're important to me, and name the things. You know, I've seen that you fall really silent when Sean speaks for you, you know, or give solid examples of things that you notice. You know, and it's good to point those things out that are non-physical, the things that are emotionally abusive, controlling, manipulative, because those are the things that get minimized by a lot of other people and friends who notice them. So in a nutshell, those are some tips for how to help in a situation. Are there other things you want to talk about from the show?
I can't think of any other examples. I just keep thinking of like the contrast between the support and validation that she gets when she's in group therapy versus all of the people that she has in her life, and how much easier of a journey this would have been if her mother, father, friends had been supportive of the decisions that she was making, of her desire to keep herself and Maddie safe. It takes a community to end domestic and sexual violence. It can't be all up to the Alexes of the world, but we need active bystanders and good friends and family members to step in when they see things like this. Be willing to ask, how can I help you? How can I help you? While not making decisions for you, so that you have some power and control back. So thank you for sharing those tips, Leslie.
Absolutely.
I want to end with like a couple of the last scene. I don't think it was the last scene, but before she moves to university and she has this big confrontive moment with Sean, of she tells him, "You will never control me again, because now I have a better understanding of what's going on." And it's just one of those like nice fantasies that I think if people had, you know, this sense of safety to be able to do that they would love to just tell the harm doer off that way. But the series ended in such a hopeful way that it is possible to break the cycle of violence and to find safety and things like that. So yeah, thank you, Christina. She put in the chat, does anybody have any questions for our panel? We've got about 2 minutes and would love to answer any questions.
While we wait for any questions, I think that that conversation she had with Sean at the end is something we do therapeutically in a letter. Many times without the intention to send, because many times it can provoke or escalate violence, or we don't get the apology, or we don't get the accountability that we're hoping for, and it can, just make things harder. And so it's typically that looks like other interventions as well, but a letter to them, it's saying exactly what they feel, but with no intention to send. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. That makes sense, to find that sense of closure too. Okay, thank you all for joining us on this conversation. This is going to be, this has been recorded and it will be shared on social media. If you or someone you know would like to reach out to Resilience, our 1-800 number is 848-5991, and we're available 24 hours a day. Also reach out if you would like a presentation or some training, want to discuss any training opportunities for yourself or groups that you may be a part of. We offer a range of services for churches, salons, businesses, other kinds of institutions to continue to build our bystander army and domestic and sexual violence as a community in our community. Thank you very much for tuning in and have a great afternoon. Bye.